She wakes up early. She always does. 5:30 in the morning, before the alarm goes off, before the sun has even risen. My daughter is 15 and runs as if her life depended on it, and in a way, it does. It's how she regulates herself, calms herself, finds herself. I see it in her eyes, when she ties her sneakers, ties up her hair, and goes out with a stopwatch on her wrist. That day, it was routine training, a circuit of 4 laps around the block to simulate the exam she would have at school. She wore sweatpants, a baggy t-shirt, and a hoodie. Nothing strange about that. It wasn't a parade, it was a race. And in that neighborhood, surrounded by rules as it was, walking or running with a hood over your head wasn't a crime. Or, at least, it shouldn't be. But here she comes, the woman, the usual one, that resident who nobody remembers by name, but everyone knows the tone of her voice, the one who appears in the HOA group whenever the garbage isn't perfectly lined up or when some child dares to exist by making noise on the sidewalk. She saw my daughter running, and she didn't see a teenager in training. She saw suspicious movement in a common area. She grabbed her cell phone. She called community security, a nice name for an outsourced service run by 2 men in a golf cart with a flashlight and a radio. There's a person running around the block several times. It could be someone studying the environment for something bigger. Wear black, a hoodie. She's a teenager. She looks aggressive. Yes, she said aggressive, because running without smiling, according to her, was a sign of trouble. The car arrived in 7 minutes. The security guard approached my daughter, radio in hand and looking like he was doing her the biggest favor of his life. He asked where she lived. He asked why she was running there. He asked if she had authorization from the HOA to use that route repeatedly. She answered. She said she was the daughter of the resident of House 17. She said she always ran there. She said she was just practicing. But the man called for backup. 2 local police cars arrived. And then the circus was on. My daughter stopped, gasping for breath, not understanding. One of the policemen asked her if she had any ID. She didn't. She was 15 years old and had gone out running in her own neighborhood. The other said that, as they were facing a potentially dangerous situation with an unaccompanied minor, they would take her to the police station for investigation. They said that it's better to be safe. And what did she do? She froze, scared, offended, humiliated, because running was now a threat, and the sweatshirt, a sentence. She was taken away, without handcuffs, but with the car on. And the woman? She was there, filming from afar, with a discreet smile, like someone who believes she's saved the neighborhood from a middle-aged criminal who just happened to be 15. I got the call from the police station before I even knew she'd left the house. Your daughter is here. We had a misunderstanding at the condominium. Everything's fine now. The officer's voice was soft, fearful, like someone who already understood that he'd made a bad mistake and was trying to find an excuse before he got a scolding. When I got there, she was sitting alone, her face still wet and her body shaking, not from cold, from revolt, from fear, from tiredness. She said, without looking me in the eye, "They thought I was someone trying to break in, and that's when something ignited inside me. Something that wasn't just anger. It was a sharp, calculated, professional sense of justice. Because that case wasn't just personal. It was legal. It was unacceptable. And, by a perfect alignment of irony and karma, I was exactly the right person to solve it. Because the HOA's misconduct case, that case that was being handled in secret, full of allegations of abuse, veiled racism, and absurd regulations, had landed on my desk 2 weeks earlier. The name of the woman who called? It was on 3 other complaints, for irregular approach, defamation, and misuse of the community safety channel. At that moment, she stopped being just the noisy resident on the corner and became the defendant in the case. And I officially became the federal judge in charge of deciding the association's fate, and, with it, that of the woman who tried to shackle my daughter's freedom. I didn't say anything that morning, not a word. I just took my daughter home. The silence was necessary. She needed to breathe, and I needed to think. Because what happened to her wasn't an error of judgment. It was a reflection of a rotten system, where prejudice comes wrapped in community order paper. The kind of poison that doesn't kill with force. It erodes little by little. As she showered, still shivering, her cell phone rang nonstop. Messages from friends, schoolmates, and even strangers. The video was already on the net. Someone filmed the moment she was approached by HOA security, surrounded by two men who seemed more anxious for authority than concerned about anything real. The caption on the video was a slap in the face. 15-year-old girl arrested for running too much in a neighborhood where running is forbidden for those who don't fit in. The views grew like dry fire in a tall bush, and along with them, the comments. People angry, people laughing, people asking if it was a meme, and in the midst of the chaos, names began to appear. Names of people responsible, names of HOA figures, and, of course, her name. The woman's face was identified in less than 12 hours. It was cross-referenced with other images of association meetings, previous videos where she gave speeches about safety and standardizing youth behavior, and even an old bulletin where she had registered a complaint against children running around unsupervised. The internet dug deep, and it wasn't long before they found other reports. One lady commented that months earlier, the same woman had called security saying that her grandson, a 10-year-old boy, was riding his bike too fast in front of the houses. Another said that her daughter was followed to the door because she was laughing loudly on the way to school. The pieces were put together. Her image in the community went from active member to obsessive vigilante with a tendency to stalk. But the worst was yet to come. On Monday, I returned to the courthouse. In the office, the case file against the HOA was on the table. The cover was already sweaty from handling it. Only now, I was reading it with different eyes. The accounts of harassment and abuse were detailed. People intimidated for walking a dog off the leash. Anonymous letters about unacceptable noise, always coming from the same street. Calls to the security service for absurd reasons. And in almost every record, her name. But what made me decide to act differently was the last document attached to the file. An email, signed by her, with the subject, Suggestion of a New Clause for the Bylaws. In the body of the text, the suggestion was simple and monstrous. Insert a clause that prevents unaccompanied minors from circulating in common areas for periods of more than 10 minutes, at the risk of a formal warning to those responsible. She officially wanted to turn the act of a child or adolescent walking or running alone in their own neighborhood into a community infraction. She wanted to regulate the absurd, to legalize abuse, to make a rule of what until then had only been social arrogance. And that, in my position, was the point of no return. I called in the advisor. I asked for a complete review of the complaints where her name appears. I requested a letter from the prosecutor's office to gather the victims and make room for additional testimonies. From that moment on, the case had a name and a face, and the woman, who until then had only been part of the HOA, was now being investigated as the perpetrator of repeated discriminatory conduct under the guise of association authority. No public statement, no interview, only action. Real justice doesn't need a spotlight. Meanwhile, in her street, the atmosphere changed. Glances turned. The neighborhood whispered. She no longer went out without sunglasses and a scarf. Nor did she go to the market alone. Even the HOA group collapsed. 4 members quit. One publicly apologized for having previously supported her decisions, and the most symbolic, a petition emerged demanding that she be suspended from any activity in the association until the investigation was over. 63 people signed it, including 2 former allies. She tried to respond. She emailed everyone. A long text, dramatic, claiming that she was being wronged, that it was all just collective hysteria, that her intention was to protect. She ended by saying that the community deserves order before emotion. but no one bought it. The answer came quickly. The community deserves justice before its ego, and the document that would make this official was already being drafted, with all the letters, with all the names, with all the absurdities transformed into an article. Because anyone who tries to imprison freedom on the basis of a sweatshirt will one day end up imprisoned in their own silence. The hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday. Cold, gray, one of those days when even the wind seems at odds with the world. The room wasn't full. It was a technical, preliminary session with no public audience. But the tension occupied every available centimeter. You only had to look into people's eyes to realize that this wasn't just about laws. It was about something more primitive, respect. She arrived accompanied by a new lawyer, young, with the manner of someone who accepted the case only after much insistence or desperation. They were sitting across from each other, side by side, without exchanging a word. Her face was a sculpture of rigidity. No smile, no gesture. Just the mask trying to hold back what was no longer enough. The prosecutor opened the case file. He read aloud the excerpts from the previous complaints. Her name was mentioned 5 times. Cases involving children, teenagers, racialized residents, always with the same pattern. An exaggerated concern, an intuitive suspicion, a complaint made out of community zeal. Beautiful words that, when translated, said only one thing: social persecution disguised as responsibility. Then the videos were shown. One of my daughter being approached, cornered, and taken away. Another of a teenage girl being followed by the same woman's cell phone camera for 4 blocks, just because she was carrying a backpack that was too big. With each image, the room seemed to shrink a little. The muffled sound of the recordings echoed louder than any argument her lawyer could use afterwards. When the judge, another judge, specially assigned to the case, asked her to speak, she hesitated. Her voice came out shaky, but still trying to sound firm. I never intended to cause anyone pain. I just followed my instincts. We're in a country where safety needs to be a priority. The word instincts hung in the air, as if she had confessed more than she wanted to, as if to say, I saw someone different, so I thought it was dangerous. The prosecutor smiled. He didn't need to say anything. The evidence spoke for itself. But what no one expected was the request of one of those present, a resident of the neighborhood, an elderly woman, her neighbor for years, who was there as a witness. She calmly stood up and asked to be heard. The judge allowed it. She sat down, took the microphone, and began, I've known this woman for 12 years. I've been to HOA parties, meetings, coffees organized by her. I always thought she was just strict, but after I saw what she did to the judge's daughter, I realized that rigidity was just a cover for a constant fear of everything she doesn't understand. She never bothered me, because I'm just like her. Same color, same age, same accent. But I've seen how she looks at others, how she treats those who seem different, and I never said anything. Today, I do. Silence. The woman put down the microphone. She returned to her seat, but she left a noise in the room. The woman didn't react. She just stood there, frozen. The lawyer wriggled in his chair, no longer knowing how to get around. The process that was just a review of the HOA's conduct had now become a public mirror, and her reflection was anything but dignified. The judge closed the session by informing her that the final decision would be made in a short period of time, given the seriousness of the facts and the urgency of defining the limits of the association's actions on the private lives of residents. Outside, she left with her face covered, trying to escape a shame that didn't depend on a camera or flash, because there, in that corridor, everyone had already seen it. Justice doesn't have to be scandalous to be effective. Sometimes it just sits back, it observes, and when it speaks, it doesn't need to shout. That night, my daughter slept lighter. For the first time since the episode, she knew that, even if she didn't run that day, the world was working in her favor. But the end was yet to come. Because karma signed in gold pen usually has more than one page. 2 weeks after the hearing, The sentence was published. There was no fanfare, no spotlight, and no interviews. But the city stopped to read it. The document, more than 20 pages long, precisely unraveled every conduct, every abuse, every call without justification. And every time her name appeared, it was like an extra nail closing the lid on a reputation that could no longer stand. The judge was surgical. He declared that the HOA had exceeded all its legal powers by allowing members to act as personal conduct inspectors based on subjective, discriminatory, and unregulated criteria. In simple words, the association lost the right to pretend that it is more in charge than the Constitution itself. But what really turned the tide was Item 4 of the ruling: the immediate suspension of all HOA board members, including the defendant, with an indefinite veto on her return. Along with that, the demand for a complete restructuring of the bylaws, overseen by an independent group, to prevent anyone from trying again to turn the neighborhood into a private regime of selective oppression. And there was more. The woman, now officially identified in the case file, was sentenced to do community service for 6 months at an NGO that works with young people in situations of social vulnerability. It wasn't just punishment, it was a lesson, because nothing teaches more than dealing with what you tried to exclude. In addition, she would have to publish a formal apology in 3 local newspapers and 1 state newspaper, with the text reviewed by the courts. No half words, no, if anyone felt offended. The text would be direct. I apologize to the teenager unjustly detained for my hasty and discriminatory denunciation. Her name, my daughter's name, and the official record that the line between arrogance and crime has been crossed. The impact was immediate. Her house became a blind spot. Absolute silence. The curtains remained closed for days. The neighbors, once passive, now took a clear stand. A new wave of movement emerged in the community. Open meetings, without hierarchical structure. Agendas about diversity and freedom. The neighborhood began to heal from the shadow she had cast for so long with her zeal and instinct. On the Saturday following the sentence, my daughter ran for the first time since the incident. Same pants, same sweatshirt, headphones in her ears, focused gaze. But this time, something was different. Every few blocks, someone waved. A man lifted his cap. A group of children clapped their hands. Even a lady came out of her garden and said, "Run with pride, young lady. Today, the asphalt is yours." She smiled, and she ran lighter than ever. The HOA, under new management, has removed the most absurd rules from the bylaws. No clause on visually acceptable conduct. No article on repetitive activities in the common area. The new president made a point of this at the first meeting. Anyone who doesn't want to see people living in freedom should close the windows, but don't try to imprison the world outside. The woman, for her part, left the house. She sold it for less than it was worth. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't show up at the market or at church or anywhere. She disappeared. The only reason she was known to have left was because the moving truck arrived at dawn with its headlights off. But her name stayed, not in the newspapers, not on the murals. It remained in conversations, as a synonym for warning, as an example of what not to be. And perhaps that's worse than any fine. Because reputation, when it sinks into the mud, no longer dries out in the sun. The case echoed for months. It became a study at universities, the subject of seminars on institutional racism disguised as bureaucracy, and was cited in federal documents as an example of a legal limit on non-state community action. In other words, a Karen tried to play sheriff in a neighborhood and ended up with a sentence signed by the state itself. The greatest irony? She never knew who she was dealing with. She never knew that the girl she had arrested was the daughter of the federal judge responsible for reviewing the association's legal limits. She didn't know that the process she dismissed as bullshit from people who want to make a mess was in the hands of someone who doesn't accept abuse as a policy of coexistence. And even if she had, it wouldn't have made a difference. because what fell to her wasn't privilege, it was justice. And justice, when it really comes, doesn't knock on the door. It breaks down. And if you liked this video, don't forget to leave a comment and a like.